maybe switch over to a little bit of education. So what are we showing? Oh, yes, custom elements. Mark, will you take it away and talk to us about custom element types?
Yeah, and I'll go relatively quickly through this, but feel free to ask questions as well. Just feel free to stop me and ask. And then Drew will go in a little more depth, and then we'll have Michael show what he's up to with Notion as well. So let me show my screen. All right, can you all see that? And all right, cool. So let me get the little video out of the way. There we go. Okay, so I've just got a little test project here. And on the test project, I have a little preview where when I click this button, what's happening is it's running an action, and that action runs a flow that has this action that actually has a script inside of it. So Shannon brought this up a couple of weeks ago that, hey, you can actually just like insert script into the HTML of an element. And the problem comes here, not necessarily in this kind of context where I'm like manually doing that. This is not really how this would result in a problem. But the issue was basically if you're allowing your users to create content and that content is going to be public, and if they put into that content a script, the JavaScript could actually like do anything. You know, it could like go grab cookie information and then like do a request out and save that cookie information to their servers or something like that. And so by allowing your end users to like publish publicly on your project, you're potentially allowing them to like do injections and things on the browser level and the client level. And so we did a little work on the render function, and I thought it was a good opportunity to show how element types in Bildr operate and how you can actually go in and make this change in the functions inside of your project anytime you want to, and then use that function instead of our base function. I'm going to show you what we did, and this is the first step in this. There actually will be additional security things going on along the same lines, but I wanted to use it as an example. So over on the left side, we have element types and action types. So for instance, an element type is represented inside of the element dropdown where you have like a header, a div, text paragraph. These are what we call element types. The action types are when you have the add button clicked on a flow. Each of these are what we call action types. So these are all the different actions that can be performed. And in every project, those are housed inside of these two things. So when a new project is created, we actually put an instance of those element types and action types in your project. So they're not coming from like a base repository. They're actually housed inside your project, which means you can modify not only the configurable part of it, like what the input arguments are, but actually the JavaScript that's executing whenever one of them is used in the executing project. So let's take a look at this element type for heading. So if I go type in heading, click on that one, you can see we have properties and we have JSON. So whatever properties you fill out here, that's described in this JSON here, right? So we typically do this throughout Bildr where we'll show you actually what the platform is generating. If you ever want to, you can actually go in there and modify it manually. You can change that and it will actually update back in here. Typically it's safer to just do it in the properties, but we like to expose all of that for, because we understand as a group of developers delivering for clients and building products that we're launching, sometimes you just need that level of depth. So on an element type, you can see that there's this one input called display.js function. This is the render function, the JavaScript function that's actually going to execute when an element instance of this type runs on the page. So every heading uses this same JavaScript function called render HTML element. That render HTML element function is actually a generic function that's used across most of these elements. So you'll see in here that it's actually the same one for like almost every generic HTML element. There are some of them like the grid list and some other ones that have their own render functions. So you'll see like this is render grid function. To look at those actual JavaScript functions, those are in this little functions tab. So if we go take a look at the render HTML element function. We've got properties, JavaScript, and JSON again. So if we go look at the JavaScript, this is the actual JavaScript that does the rendering based on the input arguments of the instance of that input. So what we did, I asked the developer to go and look at our render function and add a new option to it called do not sanitize. So the default is going to be to sanitize, but if you toggle it, it will not sanitize. So you can choose whether or not to sanitize these scripts in and out of it. It's actually more than scripts because you also want to potentially sanitize for form tags and things like that as well. And there's more to it than what we've done here so far, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But basically, you could come in here and just do this exact thing in this function. And what happens in this one in particular, the way that we implemented it, we have this one thing where the JavaScript looks like it uses a variable called do not sanitize scripts. And that comes from an input argument that's on the element type, where it's either a true or a false value. And then in the JavaScript somewhere, I'm not a developer, so I'm not like super versed in this, but somewhere in here, there's actually like an if statement effectively that says, is that true or false? And if it's allowing, or it's requiring the sanitization of scripts, and it runs through other code. Part of that code is like right here, where this is basically going and looking for the script tag and removing it, right? So when that executes, what happens is the set value sets into the element, and it runs the method for set value using that render function. And when that occurs, it runs through that and says sanitize it and removes it. So that's why it says before after. So if we go back into here and just take a look again at that action. So you can see it says before, and then it has the script, and then after. So what it's doing is just sanitizing it. So all of that is to say that the way that the thing is structured in Bildr, you have the JavaScript function, then the function belongs or is used in an element type. That element type is used one or more times on a specific page. And every time there's an element of that type on the page, it runs through that function, uses these arguments, whatever they are. So like on the heading, it uses these properties. And then from there, it runs that JavaScript, and that JavaScript is actually what's doing the rendering of that element. And so at any time you want to, you can come in and modify any of these action types, any of their functions, any of the element types, any of their functions. So we'll take a quick look at that set value. This is the set value function. So you can just come in here and change it. I think it was Tim who asked, how do we get one back? Like if we make the change, right? So there's a couple of ways. One is it's just in the base toolkit. So if you just open another project, you would have the original that we had in there. So you could always just get it from there. But also I would actually recommend, rather than using this one and just modifying it, I typically would make a duplicate of it. So just duplicate the function or duplicate the action type. That way you just leave it there. But we give you the ability.
Exactly what I'm doing now, Mark.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we've gone back and forth. We used to lock these down. We just you couldn't edit them. The problem is sometimes you just need to edit them. Like you've already got it in use in 100 places in your project and you need to modify it. And we basically just trust our users, right? We trust that you're going to figure that out. And then if you don't figure it out, we'll help you solve for that too. So that's really how we approach it. We approach it more like how a developer would approach it, or how a development environment would approach this kind of thing. Open it up, but teach people how it should work and how to operate it, and give you things like easy ways to duplicate things, So you can come in here and duplicate an action type or an element type, duplicate the render function and point them to each other, and then just modify those however you want. And you can always revert back. So if you make a duplicate element type, it'll just show up in here as another option, so you might have footer number 2 or whatever inside of the list.
And if you didn't want to see 2, you could theoretically archive the original. And then if you ever need to bring it back, toggle the unarchive and then just mark it unarchived and it comes back. So there's, some flexibility there.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think there's a good bit of that will occur as you're, basically what we end up doing is we would always end up getting here's our base stack that we like to use. And it takes some time, right? you're going to have a bunch of new element types that you add for your projects and all these different things. And then at some point, you're on like project number 3 and you kind of have the things you like. You've got your page templates that you like to start from. You might have some patterns that you start from. Those patterns already include these custom element types and actions in them. And you're really always starting from that same thing over and over again, but it takes some time. Usually design and dev shops will get there eventually though, in whatever stack they're doing. It's just like starting in any other new stack.
Awesome.
Nice, Shannon.
So yeah, I think this is awesome. The way we approached it too, like just some other ways to think about this is we allow that text to come through on some of our elements, but we just encode it as text instead of allowing it to render as the actual HTML. And so when the render function happens, it, instead of putting open script, close script, it does the ampersand whatever code for an open tag is. So you still like the text of alert, this was alert, would still show. And this is kind of nice for things like where we want to show like HTML or code. Maybe we're storing that for users to view, but we don't want it to actually embed and do stuff. So what we did is we created an allow list of basically these tags are allowed to happen. Like maybe we want them to be able to bold. We want them to be able to do like a horizontal line or just some like formatting based off a WYSIWYG. And then the other ones that are just explicitly denied won't be allowed through. And also, like he was talking, like we have the custom elements, but you can also modify the actions. So as you put data in database, you can also encode it as it's going in. That way you've got a little bit of double protection there to encode it going in and encode it coming out to make sure that it's all good and clean.
Yeah, there's a bunch of, I mean, there's almost an infinite number of considerations and methods in this stuff, right? So, I mean, one thing we're not doing at all in there, for instance, is if you write in there, say you write an image tag, and then inside of the image tag, you put like on mouse enter, and then put your script in there, right? That's a different thing. And so there is a way to do that where you can actually like get those elements, not with a string parse, but like you can actually do it with rendering. It's not really rendering, it's like writing it to the DOM effectively, but not actually rendering it. And then you have the output that then you can sanitize that output no matter how far down the nesting is. So eventually we'll end up doing it in an incredibly sophisticated, like having every option and all these things. But we figured might as well get something out quick that can solve the problem for like the 99% use case, allow you to toggle it off for the one you want, and then you can always dive deeper with custom code if you ever want to. And really, if anyone, the thing about this type of a concern is that from a security perspective, it requires a lot of things to go wrong before it becomes like a serious issue, in that you have to have enough users coming to that thing, and you have to have someone who's been malicious on it, and there has to be data there that's useful to grab, and there's all kinds of things like that. And this is the time when we want to solve for all these things before we're at scale, before we're before we're already there. So feel free to bring this stuff up now, because this is whenever we want to do it, right?
Yeah.
I think I'll stop there because we're going to run out of time. I want to let Drew and Gill say some things.
Yes. Michael, are you down for showing us or walking us through what you're working on for the Notion element?
Sure. Yeah, let me pull it up now. So just as a high level overview, I'm working on a calendar app. It's a new way to sort of envision and manage your calendar. And when I saw the Notion API came out, I wanted to look at ways to integrate it. And the first thing that came to mind was just, I have my notes in Notion on like what I want to build. And at that particular time, I was doing a live stream. So I even had like notes for my last live stream of things that I wanted to check off the list and didn't get to. And so I thought that it would be cool to pull those into Bildr and have them like on my canvas, like have my Notion docs on my canvas so I could see all my notes and even check them off and stuff like that. So I haven't done it yet, to be clear. I'm still working on it, but I can show you kind of the approach that I'm taking to it. And Mark helped me out a ton with this, but the Notion API, if anybody's used it, it's very early on. There's not a whole lot of functionality. There's only a few things that you can do with it. But the approach that I'm taking is I'm able to pull in a list of all of my pages. And if I go to a specific page, I can have the elements from my Notion doc render. Now, there's some challenges to exactly how I'm building these out. Basically, only certain types of blocks of content in Notion are supported through the API. So if I look at my original, like this is my original Notion doc here, and this one's just a checklist, or it's a series of to-dos of stuff that I want to build. So there's not too much here that's unsupported by the API, other than there's a challenge around updating these, like when you actually check them off. But apart from that, it's pretty straightforward. The odd thing is the way that this data comes through in the API. So it's just a list of every block. So you'll have a H3, and then you'll have a to-do and a to-do and a to-do. And then when it gets down to the next section, there's another H3. So I'm going to have to do some parsing of that and putting those into the right blocks, because what I really want to do is like a grid list for each set of to-dos, right? And then an H3 and then another grid list, that kind of thing. So I'm working through that. I don't have the functionality yet to where you can actually check these off, but that's kind of the idea. And I'll be able to kind of go through my list here and pick which docs I want to work on and have those in my canvas as I'm working. My thinking behind that was just no context switching. Like, you know, I can stay in the flow of working in Bildr, and that's usually where a lot of my priorities are. The approach that I took to this is a little odd, but what I wanted to have was a custom element type that I could drag and drop onto my canvas and then have it just start rendering. And so again, Mark helped me out a lot with this, but this is literally just a page with an iframe on it. And the iframe is actually pulling from a page in another Bildr project. So I have a Bildr project that essentially lets you, it's the project that's interacting with the Notion API. So it's actually making the API calls to get my docs and all of that. And
so hang on, I want to stop right there for just one sec.
Sorry.
So just to clarify this, basically Michael wanted to put plugins into the studio before we offer plugins in the studio, and we were brainstorming of how we could do that. And in that brainstorming conversation, it was like, oh wait, if you make a separate project, make your own project somewhere else, and that other project integrates with Notion, then inside of any of your projects, you could just have an element type that just points to the other project and shows the frame of that other project inside of any of your projects on the canvas. So effectively, Michael created the first Bildr plugin without any support for Bildr plugins yet. So I thought that was a really novel and cool approach to doing it. And technically you can, because you're inside the studio, that thing can do anything you want in the studio because you're logged in. So it can actually, you can take this further and interact with the studio itself through this method. So sorry, Michael, I just wanted to.
No, that's good. Yeah, I anticipate some challenges and some roadblocks with this because I'm trying to make these things, both Bildr and the Notion API, I'm trying to make them do things they're not intended to do. But that's never stopped me before. So we'll see. We'll see. Eventually I'll have to make concessions on what I'm actually trying to do. But essentially, yeah, I just have a grid list on this in this other project that's just called Notion Pages. And it's got a set of rows. And each row is just a page entry from the Notion API. And that's what's rendering on this screen here. So that's kind of where I started. And then as always, I got distracted along the way with another idea, which was I thought it would be cool to have like stickies in my Bildr canvas as well. And so these are not actually hooked up yet. These are just like stubbed out. But my thinking is I could have an element type for stickies that I literally just drag and drop on the canvas. They wouldn't render in my app. So when I actually build my calendar app, these aren't pages that would be loaded anywhere. You wouldn't ever see these, but I would see them on the canvas. And it's literally just like a Post-it note for me to type in, you know, a reminder that I want to explore using Colenso instead of Google Calendar, or, you know, just kind of to-dos. And so my plan for this is using the Notion databases feature. So in Notion, the database is just an entry of records. They're essentially each their own page, but it's kind of plain text content, which would work really well for a Post-it note. And so my thinking is I'll use the Notion database, just have a database of stickies. I'll be able to type new ones in here because the Notion API will actually let me write those. So I can create new pages and insert them into the database through the API. So that's my working theory. We'll see if I can actually pull it off, but I think it's possible. So that's kind of what I'm working on there.
That's awesome. And, you know, to kind of back up to what Fraser was asking about with like, what is the structure of Bildr and kind of how do things operate? Bildr is incredibly open-ended on almost every front. Like we really try hard to not have much opinion. And you can sort of see it coming through in this sort of like, I'm just going to work around how Bildr works. I mean, basically this canvas, all it's doing is rendering HTML. The only difference between what you see on the screen in the canvas and what you see in the executing project, the only actual difference is that in here, we don't bind the events for like click and those kind of things because we have to use those events for other things on the page. Like when you click on it, it needs to select it. Everything else is identical. So what that means is that every one of these things inside of here can be anything. Anything that the web can do can actually live inside of this. So by putting an iframe as the element type that Michael drug on there, that can literally do anything that you want because it's just a frame to some other web app, right? So it could be a Bildr project, but it really could be anything. Michael, I have a question. Is there, and I know the Notion API is like brand new and I don't, you know, may not have everything yet or whatever, but my assumption was that like you could just like show a list of the pages and then when you click on a page, like just load the actual page just like you have in that other tab.
You would think so. No. So Notion prevents you from embedding their pages. Like you can't actually render a page through, you can't render their page through an iframe. I can actually show you, like if I take this page and if I drop it in this iframe, it just gives you this Notion refuse to connect.
And they won't let you do an API with the key or anything? Like it just doesn't do it?
No, I've looked up the forums and quite a bit of documentation around it, and it's just something they don't allow today. That would make it a lot easier.
That seems like use case number one for their API to me. That's
right.
That was my assumption of the use case, but that's crazy. All right.
Yeah.
Like it's still early.
They're getting a lot of, yeah, it's still early. They're getting a lot of feedback. I think they may change that up. So anyway, that's what I've been working on mostly. I did do a style guide, a CSS, not a style guide. I did basically just helper for Flexbox, like to show you how to lay it out. And then I also did this week a character counter like limiter where you could type into a box. Actually, I could just show you real quick. It's on this here. So I have this app where you can fill out a profile, and I've got a text area for a bio, because like you put in a username, full name, and it's updating it up above here. But there's a spot for a bio, but I only want the bio to be so big. And so it limits you when you hit a certain number of characters, and you can actually see the character counter and it turns red and all that. So I just created basically I just modified the text area element to let me set the max length, which is the HTML attribute, and then just did a couple of actions to manage how it operates when you hit the limit or when you're below the limit.
Did you add an argument for that? for the limit on the,
Yeah, just the max length. So that's in this project here. So I just added this max length parameter, which is it's a supported HTML element, and that's what sets the limit.
can you go to the element type? Because this is like a perfect example of just taking what our little base toolkit is and just extending it for the things that we haven't gotten to yet, right? So
so I took this one, I believe it was text area multi-line. Yep. And then all I did was I came here to arguments and I just added an argument here. I added this one called max length. I knew that max length is the name of the HTML argument that I wanted to add, but you could, just Google it if you're not sure. But I set that, just gave it the name max length. I hit the toggle to tell it that it is an HTML attribute. And then I set the type, which is for the input. It's basically what type of data are you inputting? I set that to a number, and that was it. That's really all I had to do to get that extra element in there.
and so just in general, what's going on there is this text area multi-line element type is using that render HTML element function. So what it does, that render function knows to look at the arguments, and if that flag of this is an HTML attribute, if that's on, then the render function knows to write that thing as an attribute. So, and actually this is the same methodology that allowed us to really easily integrate Lottie, for instance, because Lottie basically is just all HTML arguments, and the library just like reads the arguments and then renders this animation based on the JavaScript or the JSON file and the attributes that are set there. So like on a Lottie, you say whether you want a loop or not, and that's actually just an HTML attribute of loop, true or false. And so it just reads it. So it allowed for, this is the type of flexibility we really wanted to make sure we build into Bildr, because we know like we can't ever get 100% of what you all are going to want. There's always going to be something that you all want to do that we just don't do. So our base things are pretty flexible. That base render function is pretty flexible for this type of thing. And then you can always, if there's something that the function doesn't allow you to do, that's when you go to that next level, go to the element type function, duplicate it, and you can just wipe out anything you don't want to use in there and add your own JavaScript and make your own element type to do literally anything you want. And maybe, we're going over time, but I was thinking maybe, Drew, do you want to just show real quick the part where you bring a library before, just so that way, like in Lottie, don't we do that?
Yeah.
Just that way, this is a pretty technical and like all the way down the rabbit hole thing, but this kind of uses our Bildr API, the JavaScript API, and those kind of things. Go ahead, Drew.
Do you want background on this, or maybe to show that quick, because we are running over.
A little background, probably be good.
Little background. This Lottie. So I'll just give like a quick version as quick as I can. But this Lottie, this is a project for a webinar we're doing on Tuesday, where we're using Lottie. So Lottie's gonna show some stuff, then we're gonna show some stuff. And one of the things we wanted to do, it'll only work in this live view, is there's this kind of Lottie that's newer where as you scroll, it moves. So my task to get ready for this webinar, we can use the built-in Bildr Lottie for these, but I had to create a new element for this interactive Lottie. And so the way you do that, Lottie's documentation is pretty simple. You can add the library through yarn, npm, or the script, just put a script on your page. And then you have the Lottie player element that Mark was just talking about with the attributes. And then you just add this little snippet of code. And so to make an element like that in Bildr is actually pretty straightforward. So if I come in, I'll skip the actual element part of the inputs, but that's there. And then the render function, I create a custom one. So render Lottie existed. And actually I can, just to be clear on what I did here, I mostly just copy pasted. This whole element is just copy pasted from other stuff. So I started, if I come into this JavaScript tab, I started by copying from the Lottie element a bunch of these base things, which probably to about here or so. which are like the things in Builder that to set value in or to bind data in the studio. There's all these little things. They're optional because your element might not need it. But in this case, like if I want it, I can just copy and paste all this. And I know what this is from working in this before, but essentially just copy and pasted that. And then there's this section right here, which is going to render the actual Lottie. And then there's a section down here, which is going to call that script tag that Mark was just referring to. So this line 121 is what I was really getting at here, where this BAPI is Builder API. So these are like some built-in stuff. So you can use these in element functions and action functions. And there's a bit of documentation on these, but I don't even think they're fully documented at all. But basically, if I want to include a header script in a normal project, I can put it in a page header and it'll run every time the page loads. But in these element render functions, I want to share this interactive Lottie element and I want someone to be able to drop it on. I don't want them to have to create their own page header or do anything extra. So I use this BAPI helper that's called add header script. And the cool thing about it is I grabbed the URL of the CDN, the JavaScript file, which I got from this Lottie player. So this via CDN, this is the actual JavaScript file I need. I just dropped that right into here. And what I'm doing is I'm giving this like a name. It's basically an ID on that script tag when it gets inserted. I'm giving it the JavaScript file, and then I'm giving it a function to run when it's loaded. And the function right up here just refreshes the element basically. But the beauty of this header script thing is that I can include this Lottie interactive script. And if it's not there, if this element renders, if that script's not on the page, it'll put it on the page. It'll wait till it finishes loading and then run this function. If I refresh that element or if I have multiple instances of that element and I add them to the page, since that script's already here, because I'm using this BAPI helper, it won't refetch that script and it won't have to wait for it to run again. Like it basically just is a smart way to load these scripts dynamically based on anything I'm doing, including in the studio. If I change the element and it has to re-render, this kind of just takes care of all that for me. So essentially all I did to make, oh, go ahead.
Sorry. So Drew, the advantage of that is you don't have to, like if you were sharing it with somebody or you're going to move it to another project, you don't have to take the custom element type over and also say you have to go add a page header.
Exactly.
It's just the element type and the page header is already included in it.
Yep, it just makes the element completely self-contained, even though it's loading an external library. And because it's like that, once you load it, you just use the library.
I'm going to use that because in a couple of my projects, I have a Twitter widget, and there's a script that has to be included with it. And I was actually just creating a second element that was like the script tag. I think I was just setting it to script tag and putting it in there. But now I'm going to use this method, the add header script. When
I first started, like my first couple elements I needed to do this with, this didn't exist like this. And I did some crazy stuff and was really proud of myself for like handling these cases. And then Darrell, who's one of the devs, was like, let me just handle this for you. And he just made this add header script, which just takes care of everything. Like it's so nice to have. So it's a big one. And I don't know, like this specifically might not be documented anywhere, to be honest. So
yeah, that stuff doesn't have much documentation yet, but you can go just look at it. We don't minimize any of our core JavaScript files that get executed in the page so that you can go look at it if you want to. So none of that stuff's minified right now on purpose. So you can go in there and look at, if you look at sources and go on the, I can't remember what the name of the actual folder is called over there, but you'll see it in there. There's all the Builder ones. And there's 4 or 5 of them in there that are the BAPI. The model is the main one. But Drew, I have a question for you real quick. On line 107 through 110, those could be input arguments, right?
Yeah. So like this is complex, and I didn't want to add confusion, but basically I didn't finish out this element to like the extent it really is. Like you can notice there's these could be input arguments. There's a weird set timeout in here that I need to get rid of. It's kind of basically a hack, but it works. And so I just didn't fully finish this off. But this Lottie interactivity thing, like if I did put one thing in here. So like I can change this to like cursor. And that's a pretty easy one where now this will animate based on my cursor, but you can actually make these crazy ones. You see how this goes when I move my mouse?
Oh,
You
nice.
can make ones where like, as you're scrolling, it plays a certain portion of the animation. Then when you get a little further, it loops. And then a little further, your cursor, like you can just make these things. And so ultimately that little bit of those options that you saw they can look so crazy. So it's a more advanced kind of,
Yeah.
input. Like I'll need to figure out something smart to make that easy for people to edit. But it's like this one has to do with the cursor. This one has to do with the positions that it's scrolling. They're kind of like, I just set really good defaults. So you could drop this element, it'll work on scroll or it'll work on cursor. And then the next step for this is I would take these and put them into some type of input argument where it can ultimately generate like, stuff that looks like this, like multiples, and you don't know how many it's doing, and they're all different values.
Wow.
So that'll just be a little more complex. That's not why it's not there now. Also because I had a deadline on this element of Tuesday.
This also looks like a good use case to kind of go into what's coming next for element types and action types, and then we can probably call it for today. But so right now, the right panel that we call the arguments, that's the properties of an element, or in an action, all the different arguments that people fill in for these different types of things that they're doing. Those are the static type of things, and there's 15 or 20 different types. So it's like a text input, a number input, like what Michael showed where he chose number for the max length. It's that kind of thing. Or you can set interactivity mode as a select, and Drew put the manual 2 options in there. So it's a fairly rigid structure there. So, which is fine for basic element types, but for something like this Lottie animation where now Drew's going to have it has to output this JSON or this array, a JSON array with different options. And then inside of there, depending on one option, it needs a different option. And it gets to be like, if you look at our grid element type, the number of options in there and the way that there's just so many things. There's 25 different input arguments in there. So those types of elements really need a custom UI for the input because there's almost no way for us to know what you would want inside of there. So we're working on a way to make it to where you can actually use a builder page, like design a builder page as the input for the whole element type. And with that, Drew could go make any UI he wants for the person setting up this Lottie animation.
Show up here in this panel.
Show up in that right panel, or really, I think what it's going to end up needing to be is something like bigger. You tell it where you want it to show up. Like, is this something that should pop up in a light box? Should it be in like a panel? How big should the panel be? Where should the positioning of that panel be? Because there's just so many different things, like charts, for instance, right? A good charting package, you end up having dozens and dozens of inputs, and they're all dependent on each other. And depending on the chart type, it has these 24 things, and that one has 12 things. And inside of there's different dependencies. So it really needs custom UIs. So that's coming for these bigger element types because it's just required. It's also what we want, honestly. Like I want to make custom, like for our grid, and for we're about to bring out Google Charts, and we're doing all these more bigger element types that just need it. So that's kind of the next step of element types.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. Well, everyone, I think we're coming up on time. Sorry for going a little bit over today. I hope you had some fun learning about custom element types. And then, for those of you who are beginners, I know Phillips is like, the whole purpose and what I'm hoping is that these guys are doing things that will make it a lot easier for you and I to just drag stuff on and fill out a few things and have it work, So yes, so power, functionality, all of that is there, but you don't necessarily need to know how to code to do things. And then, it's that balance. It's that balance that we're gonna hope to strike, but and then we'll continue to do templates and more like elements that are already designed and stuff, and patterns that you can bring in with design systems so that you don't have to necessarily learn or know how to do all that stuff. But if you do and you want to take it further, you can. Mark, were you gonna end with
Yeah.
something?
I just realized, like, well, I've got a captive audience talking about the, while we're talking about the boot camp, right? Earlier. Well, I've got you all here. So there's a couple of ways to do a boot camp. One way is you build a project, right? So everybody builds the same project and you go through the basics and then you get to a more advanced thing and you kind of get to the end result, you're building a project. And that's kind of how we were thinking we would approach the boot camp. Is that what you're thinking? Like when you're thinking of boot camp, are you thinking of, I'm going to come in, it's going to be X number of days or weeks, and I'm going to go from here to here as the output? Or did you have something else in mind? Does anybody have any thoughts or anything along those lines of what you would like to see in a boot camp?
I'm going to jump in because I'm desperately lacking in the ability. So I think if the boot camp covered off, key elements of, this is how we create a data base. This is how we connect the API. This is, but practically step by step, idiot dummy proof. And then maybe some kind of like top tips, hacks, places where we can go and cut and paste. Drew, I think you just mentioned there, cutting and pasting stuff. And I was like, whoa, that sounds up my street. So, I'm sure there are libraries of all sorts of things that I just don't know where to go and grab it. Maybe like Shannon and the Builder Hub thing. There might be kind of like a repository or something that all these kind of cheats and tricks and tips and swipe files maybe exist as part of the boot camp, maybe. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I like it. And then one other question, self-paced with mixed in of, in person, right? So that's kind of what we were thinking, is that wouldn't be in person every time. It's sort of like in-person kickoff, in-person weekly, something along those lines, and then self-paced courses, or is it more like in person every time going through each piece? Any preferences around that?
Personally, I need my feet holding to the fire. Otherwise, some other shiny project pops up and goes, "Oh, that looks good." So, any, I suppose either way, as long as like it's kind of a critical timeline path, maybe.
Jordan, did you have any feedback?
So-
Or
Yeah.
sorry, go ahead, Mike. Or okay.
Whoever. I forgot what I was going to say now exactly, but I think the self-paced, as long as there's accountability, I see that being a huge value add. Like the course I just took, we had like 24 hours to do every project, and some of those that was too fast a lot of times because other people were doing it. So it was a 5-week course total with like different projects, and everyone was doing different projects, which was cool, but also people have different challenges with that. So as a comprehensive kind of fundamentals course, doing the same project that can really lay the foundation, I think could be valuable with enough time and accountability and deadlines. I think that might be a good mix. The only problem I see with that potentially is people might fall behind and other people may be like just flying ahead. So if there was like a decision tree to go more advanced on the same project, I could see that being pretty valuable, where it's basically beginner, intermediate, advanced at a certain point. Maybe it's like user pages, logins, off it, all that good stuff, or the stuff that Drew was sharing with like Lotties and interactions, etc. So
I like the idea of like a branched out options off of it, right? So you have like the core course is getting through to build X at the end, but then you have these offshoots on each part of the course where you could get to the end and you have a totally different thing than somebody else. But everybody will kind of have the same core structure at the end of it. I like that a lot.
Michael?
Go ahead.
I was just thinking about what helped me when I was first getting up to speed on Builder. And one thing that might be cool during a boot camp is if we split everybody up and did like co-building sessions. So you pair somebody who's more experienced with Builder with somebody who's newer with Builder, and one watches the other build, right? Like you can you can learn things watching somebody who's more advanced build, but then also if some more advanced is watching you build, they can give you sort of guidance and say, try this, try that. I was lucky enough to have a couple of those early on, and that was helpful.
I'd second that. Like, I've watched hundreds of hours of Mark and Drew building, and it's like I go back and it's super, super helpful. So yeah, watching someone that knows what they're doing and like how they build kind of helps me along. Yeah.
That's great stuff. That's exactly what I was hoping to hear. Perfect. Well, we're going to get serious on that because I think it's the best approach for most people. Everyone that we've brought that up to says yes. So I think we've found a good answer there. Yeah, thank you all so much for being a part of this, coming every Friday or every other Friday, and giving us this feedback. We need this. This is exactly what we need. Really appreciate it. I want you all to know how much we appreciate you coming and showing up and giving us this time with you. So yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful weekend. Chat us in the community if you need anything, and then Lottie webinar on Tuesday. So maybe we'll see some of y'all there. Goodbye.
Bye.